Hello everyone. So in this series of tutorials, I'm going to take you through the basics of modeling within ZBRUSH. So I'll show you the basic UI within the software. I'll take you through the commonly used tools, so what kind of brushes are we going to use, and I'm going to explain some of the terminology within ZBRUSH. We're then going to take this and start modeling a skull. So we'll model a monkey's skull, and then we're going to model the jaw for the skull, then add the skin, then add the fur, render it, and then paint into it in Photoshop for the final concept. Okay, so as you load ZBRUSH, I must mention now that I'm using ZBRUSH 2019, so if you've got the up-to-date version, it might be slightly different, but all the tools are still there. So when you load ZBRUSH, you're going to come up with this menu, which is our lightbox and tools. So if you ever lose this, you can go back to lightbox and tools here on the right hand side. And here we can load up our projects, or we can load tools. So for example, we could load something like a basic human. For now, I'm just going to go back to projects, and I'm going to load a dynamesh sphere. Okay, so just a standard sphere. In this case, this one is set to a resolution of 64. So I'm going to double click on this one. And the shortcuts to move around is if you hold right click on the keyboard, then we're going to move around this sphere. If you hold shift whilst moving, it will snap along the axes. If you hold control and right click and drag from left to right or up and down, it's going to zoom in and out. And if you hold Alt and right click, then it's going to pan along this axis. So you might just want to get used to moving around, holding shift to snap, hold control to zoom in and out, and holding Alt and right click to move. So all of your shortcuts are with the right click, and then it's just the control and Alt to move, and also the shift to snap. Okay. So just get used to that, zooming in, panning around, and then letting go of the keyboard, right clicking to move. Okay. Right. So next step is we're going to use the standard brush. So here on the left hand side, we have a load of brushes that we can use. So by default, it's set to standard. If I just left click and drag, then we can see that it's created the symmetry, and it's extruding out away from the model. You can see every time that we left click and drag on the model, this little gray icon moves across the screen. That's actually creating a history of every single click that we make when we're modeling. So I can just drag this back. So there might be a specific point that I wanted to go back to. As soon as I left click again, it's going to delete that history and start all over again. So I'm going to move this all the way back to the beginning, and then that's going to delete that history. So you can see when I left click and drag, it's pulling outwards. That's because it's set to Z add. If I press Z sub, then it's going to subtract and eat into the model instead. So it's subtracting from the model. By default, it should be set to add. Some brushes are actually set to subtract by default. But I can hold Alt on the keyboard, and it will do the opposite of what's selected. So let's just go back to the beginning. If I had this set to Z add, then it will add it. If I hold Alt and left click, then it will subtract from it. Okay. If I want to smooth this selection, then I hold Shift on the keyboard, and then that will smooth it. Okay. Now with the dots, here we can actually add a pattern. So I'm just going to go right back down to the beginning again. If I change this from dots to something like drag react, then when I hold left click and drag, then it's going to drag that brush onto it. So let's just turn the intensity up just so we can see this even more. And if I hold Alt, that will subtract and drag inwards. Yeah, so if you're creating an eye socket here, you could use this technique. You're going to create the nose again, you could do the same thing. And then we could turn it back to dots and continue sculpting into this. Okay, I'll just change that back to 20 by default. And then we can smooth this out. Okay. Right, back to the beginning again. So that's the dots. We've got freehand. We've got color spray, which will spray onto this. Okay, so it's a bit more of a random pattern. And we've got dot drag as well. So we can drag it on the surface when we're happy with it. Let go of left click. So left click to drag. Where do I want it? I want it here, and then let go. I'll turn up the intensity just so I can see that a bit more. Looks like Alien, doesn't it? Creeping up his stomach. And then there you go. Let go. And it'll make that selection. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. That's our strokes. Let's go to dots. We can also select an alpha, so there might be a very specific shape that we want to add. So for example, if I can add an alpha and go to drag react, then it's going to add that alpha to the geometry. So to change the draw size, we can change it up here, or I'm using those tab keys on the keyboard. So next to P on the keyboard, bracket keys. Next to P, there's the bracket keys. We can increase or decrease the brush size. Okay, very cool. And I will show you texture in the later section of this tutorial. So I'm going to go back to dots and I'm going to turn this alpha off. So there's our sculpting menu. There are a bunch of other brushes that we use, and I'm going to load my custom UI that you're going to use in this tutorial. So if I go up to preferences and config, I'm going to load my custom UI. So I'm going to select load UI. And I'm going to go to where it's navigated to. So custom ZBRUSH. And here are all of my commonly used tools within the software. It's going to make it a bit easier just for me to go through all of these one by one. And I've also changed this to blue. You can change this yourself. So if you go to preferences and go to eye colors, these two options here I've changed to blue. The way you change them is by selecting the color that you want. So let's say you want it green. You then go to preferences and then just select here and select there, and it will turn all of these green. For now, I'm going to keep mine as blue because I like blue. So there we go. They are the only differences within this layout. If you hold Control, so right down the bottom here, you can see there's a little arrow. If you hold Control and left click and drag, and that's how we can get to our other settings. If there was something very specific that you wanted to add here, so let's say you wanted a different brush, let's say you wanted this morph brush here. So we've got morph selected on our brushes. If you can't see it at the top menu here, it might be over here. So if I just double click on this section, the brush menu may be on the left hand side. So in case you're lost, here we go. Here's our morph brush. You can go to preferences and go back to config and then say enable customize. So here, for example, I might want this morph brush right at the beginning here. So I can hold Control, hold Alt, and drag this brush into our menu here. So this is essentially what I've done with all of my brushes. All the ones that I use most commonly, I've just dragged them out into this tool menu. Make it nice and easy to use. So I'm going to go back to preferences and then say enable customize again, and then that's going to get rid of it. And that's saved my custom layout. If you wanted to then save your new custom layout, then make sure you go to preferences and save UI. And if you're using the same machine every time, then you can say store config as well. So that's going to store it within the machine when you boot it up. Okay, so let's begin. Just so that we're not getting confused by this morph, I'm just going to go back to my load UI and load this one again. There we go. So let's go down to the bottom. So first of all, let's select the Damien standard. In fact, no, let's stick at the standard brush because I want to show you something here. As I start to sculpt into this sphere, if I select the line fill, polyfill here, so now I can see my polygons, we can see that it's actually stretching all of those really neat squares into stretched out rectangles and in some cases triangles. So it's not very neat. And the more you start sculpting and pushing and pulling this geometry, the more it's going to start to deform your mesh. So if I select the polyframe again, we can see here it's looking very messy. And we can see all of our polygons. It's not very detailed and it's not very nice to look at. So I'm going to turn on this polyframe just to show our polygons. And I'm going to go up to, in fact I need to scroll down in this case, I'm going to go to the geometry panel. So you can see we've got dynamesh selected. Mine's on blue, yours might be on orange if you're not using my custom layout. And we've got a resolution set to 64. So the way that we dynamesh to clean up this geometry, so to turn it back into nice clean square polygons, is by holding Control and left clicking and dragging away from the model. So anywhere within this gray box here, we can hold Control, hold left click and drag and then let go. And it's going to re-dynamesh at that resolution of 64 in this case. So it's tried its best to try and morph all of those polygons back into neat squares and in some cases triangles. Okay, so if I turn polyframe back off, let's just see the before and afterwards. So before dynamesh and then with the re-dynamesh. Okay, so now I can hold shift and smooth this out. Currently by holding shift it will switch to the smooth tool. The intensity set to 100. You might want to bring that down if you don't want to lose too much detail. Okay, so there we go. I've just moved the intensity down to about 17. So any adjustments you make, let's say I use this snake hook tool and just drag this out. If I turn on the polyfill again, you can see that it stretched these squares out into the stretched polygons. If I re-dynamesh again, hold Control, hold left click and drag. And see I'm not dragging into the model because if I do that, it's going to make a mask, which we don't want. So I'm going to press Control Z to undo. We want to re-dynamesh by holding Control, left click and drag away from the model. And now it's nice and neat again. So that is why we re-dynamesh. So when we're making a model, we want to have a lower resolution so that we can start pushing and pulling this geometry. Right, so making our large adjustments. And then when we're happy with it and we want to start adding even more detail, that's when we increase the resolution of that dynamesh. So let's say, for example, I mean, this is not really looking like anything other than some sort of seashell. So let's re-dynamesh at 64. So once we want to add more detail, then we can increase this resolution. So let's go up to say 120. And you might need to make some sort of adjustment first. You could do a shift and smooth on an area, then re-dynamesh away from the model. Now we can see there's an awful lot more polygons within that scene. So now, although we can still use this move tool and push it out, we're now pushing an awful lot more polygons. So you're going to have to make that brush a lot bigger, but at the same time it's still only going to pull out a smaller area within that model. So you want to start low so you can pull out all of your forms to form that silhouette that you're looking for. And then you can start to increase the resolution. So I can see here I went too far back, 120 resolution and re-dynamesh. So I'm going to turn that polyframe back off and you can see when I hold shift and smooth, we've now got an awful lot more detail. So let's say, for example, we were finished with this model. If you press divide, and again, I'll go back onto polyframe so we can see here. you don't want to divide your mesh until you're happy with your model, right? So once you've done your basic blocking, you've finished your sculpt, now you want to start adding surface details. So you want to start adding, say, wrinkles to skin or chip marks, you know, on this model. That's when you could divide this mesh, and then we can see it hasn't changed the geometry, but now it's also going to be a lot smoother, and we can use, let's say, Damien standard. It's going to start cutting into this model and be a lot smoother. So if I just undo this, and I'll undo that smooth. Okay, it looks very blocky. But if I go and divide this mesh, then we've got a lot more of a smoother surface. Okay, so only divide the mesh once you're happy with your model. Okay, so let's go all the way back to the beginning here, and let's show you those masking tools. So I'm going to go back to standard. I'm going to make my brush nice and big. If I hold Control on the keyboard, it brings up the mask pen option. If I then left click, then it makes a, I'm just going to click OK here because we've moved back. It's going to delete my history. So again, holding Control, left click will make that mask selection. And if I hold Control and left click just once on the model, it then softens that edge. So you might want to not have a really harsh edge. In fact, let's re-dynamesh at something a little bit higher. Let's do it about 200 just so we can see what this looks like. There we go. So if I wanted to soften it, I can hold Control, left click on the model, and now I've got a softer edge. So this is basically anything that's dark, it's not going to make that adjustment. So if I then use my brush, then it's not going to affect that area that I masked off, right? So here I'm just holding Shift and smoothing this out. This might be the effect that you were going for. So here I could do the same thing, hold Control, left click. I can smooth it out, so I'll smooth those edges by holding Control and left clicking on the model. And then I can go back into that standard brush and then just sculpt around it. Okay. When you're happy with that selection, then you can hold Control, left click and drag away from the model. And then that undoes the mask. If I want to invert the mask, so let's just go back to the beginning here. We want our dynamesh version. Let's just go a bit further forward. There we go. So in this case, if we want to invert it, then we can hold Control, left click, make our selection, and then you hold Control and left click away from the model. Okay, so that inverts it. Okay, so hold Control, left click away from the model, and then that inverts it. So this time, anything that's highlighted white, we can start sculpting into it. So here, it would sculpt out, or I could hold Alt to go into subtract mode and sculpt this inwards. You can also go into something like the move tool, and then it will move anything that is selected within that mask. I can go back to draw, hold left click and drag away from the model to deselect and then smooth this out. Okay. If you want to smooth the entire object, then we can go up to clay polish within geometry and then select clay polish. And that's going to polish the model and keep that edge really nice and clean. Okay. So we've gone through some of our tools. We've got the standard brush, we have re-dynameshed, and we've got the masks. So I'm just going to set this back to 200 resolution and re-dynamesh. So that was the standard brush. Let's go to the Damien standard. I use these brushes an awful lot. So I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. And if I hold left click and drag, we can see it's starting to cut into that model. Okay, this is really nice for some hard surface detailing. So that's currently set to subtract by default. If I then hold Alt and left click, then it will do the exact same thing, but this time it is pushing it outwards. Okay, so I'll do this all the way around on both sides. So subtracting, we'll cut into it, and then add, we'll do the exact same thing, but outwards. Now I usually use this in conjunction with the pinch tool. So with pinch, it's going to pinch both of these together. Let's just turn the intensity down to say 8. And it's going to pinch and make this much smoother. Okay, so it's much cleaner this way by using that Damian standard and then using that pinch tool just to bring these together. So that's both of those working together, the Damian standard and that pinch brush. So let's go back. So that it was our Damian standard. There's our standard brush. The move tool does exactly that. It's going to move part of this geometry. The snake hook does the exact same thing, but this time it's going to drag an awful lot more out. So you can do something like this. And then re-dynamesh. And here I'm just smoothing it out. There we go. And re-dynamesh. Okay, so we can see it's now nice and clean. So that's the snake hook tool. We've got the clay build-up tool, which is great for just building up little sections. Okay, so here I can just build it out. Let's turn the intensity down to about 10. And this is essentially like just throwing clay on the model, eating away at it, and then holding shift just to smooth that out. Okay, make a little adjustments there. You can use the clay tubes, which is pretty much the same thing, but it's just a lot harder, shall I say. The edge is a lot harder. So it will cut away into the model just a little bit more. Okay, we've then got the flatten brush. I'm going to make this nice and big. We can see this is really good for hard surface. And you usually use the flatten brush in conjunction with something like the H polish, which will just polish this edge, which again is fantastic for hard surface. So you can flatten it just to scrape away at that surface and then use the H polish to polish that mesh. I'm just going to go back to before, let's go back to here. So that was our flatten. The inflate will inflate. So it's going to inflate the geometry. And I use this when I just need to make an overall inflation. Let's say I need this section to be a little bit thicker. I could just use that inflate and do it that way. I can then re-dynamesh and then smooth this down in conjunction with something like the move tool. So maybe I need to move this around, make it a little bit thinner. Then I can do it that way. If you've got a little piece where it's too thin, let's say I just move this until it gets really thin. So if I use that inflate tool, then it just inflates it back out. Okay. So I usually use inflate just to very quickly add some clay into the model, or any area that's too thin, I'll use the inflate tool. Okay. Smooth, that's pretty much self-explanatory. When you hold shift, it's going to smooth. Trim dynamic is very similar to the flatten, but it will flatten only smaller areas, whereas flatten will just try and flatten the entire thing. Trim dynamic will just very lightly trim parts of that model. Again, you can use that in conjunction with the H polish. Okay, you could do it that way. The trim adaptive will trim the model, but it's also going to cut an awful lot more of that model away. So here I've used that trim adaptive, which is fantastic, as you can imagine, for hard surface designs. Okay, planar just tries to eat away at the mesh. So here, anything that's flat, it can start to sculpt into it. So it's great for these kind of little edges here. You can use this planar and it'll start sculpting away. Ooh. Yeah, so that as an example. So here I've used the H polish and the planar, and then I've made a mask, and I could use that move tool, move it back, and make these kind of hard surface shapes. Pinch, you've seen that before, so as I've made that selection, I can use this pinch tool and bring them together, make a finer slit. There we go. And the layer tool will just add a layer directly on top. So if you want to just build into this, let's say for example, we wanted some sort of tube here, then we could do it that way. Go back into H polish, polish this out, go back into dynamesh and cut into it. Yeah, so these are all the tools that you can use whilst you're modeling. So just get used to them. Think, right, what brush would I use if I wanted that effect? Okay, so this is working quite well. There we go. Here we've got a curve, so you can create a curve this way. And we've got our clip curve and inflate and slice tools. So here we could slice part of this geometry. If I just go onto the polyfill, we can see that it's actually sliced this off, which is good for things like retopologizing, but we'll get into that in another video. Okay, so I'm just going to scroll all the way across. We've got the activate symmetry selected. So if I just go back to the standard brush as an example, move this across, I'm going to turn off active symmetry, so now we can just sculpt on this side without it having the symmetry. We can turn this back on. And the lazy mouse, if I sculpt like this, in fact, let's use something where I can exaggerate this. Let's use that Damien standard again. The lazy mouse will kind of drag behind, so it's similar to, I forgot the name in Photoshop. Is it the smoothing option? Yeah, I believe it's the smoothing option in Photoshop. So it's currently set to 1, so it's not really smoothing at all. But if I set this to say 50, then it will slowly drag and make a much finer selection. So it will allow us to slow down and get more details out of this brush, right? So here I could then hold Alt and drag. Ooh, it's a little bit harder with the mouse. And then make these little selections. Okay, so that's with the lazy mouse, and the radius set quite high. By default, it's set to 1. So experiment with these tools. Use this on a basic sphere for now. Here's the geometry and the dynamesh. We can increase the resolution if you want to increase the amount of polygons within the scene. To redynamesh, control left click and drag away from the model to redynamesh. If you want to polish the entire model, then we can select clay polish. And here is the subtool. If you want to, let's say, duplicate this mesh, then we can go to move and duplicate this. Oh, something is selected there. There we go. And we can also append objects into the scene. So if I just delete this, let's say I wanted to append another sphere within the scene, then I can select Append, Sphere 3D. And then here, I'm unsure why that's doing that. Let's go back to there. We can select our sphere and move this into the scene. Now, when you add a new sphere, you'll notice when I use the brushes that the active symmetry has been turned off. We can just go back here and turn this back on. And now it's back on. And then if I wanted to remove this, then I can just delete it. If I wanted to merge this, let's just go down to merge. Then we can merge visible. Ooh, let's just make sure these are selected. So we could merge down here, click OK, and now these objects are merged. If you're going to do that, make sure that both of these are set to at least the same dynamesh, otherwise it's going to look a little bit strange and it won't dynamesh properly. Okay, so let's just go back to geometry, dynamesh. Dynamesh is on. Here we go. We can re-dynamesh now. There we go. So just to demonstrate this here, how we could make these two attach, I could drag this out with the snake tool, try and push these together, re-dynamesh. And then you can see they're starting to move away from each other. That's where that inflate tool could work. So I could use inflate and inflate these until they touch, then re-dynamesh, and then smooth this out, and then make my adjustment that way. Again here, making that mask, you can hold Control and left click to make the mask. Hold Control, left click away from the model, go to something like the Move tool, push it back, and then go back to Draw, Control, left click, drag away from the model, and then we could smooth this out. Okay. That looks like a crazy stylized alien. So they are pretty much all of the tools that we will need to use to model a skull. In this case, it will be a chimpanzee skull. And then we can start to apply the skin using pretty much the same techniques once we've modeled that skull. Okay, so experiment with this. If you run into this problem, let me just show you this now. If for some reason you get your model kind of in the background, it's almost as if there's an image of your model within the background, then that's because you need to go to layer, and you see this will select layer 1, just press clear and then that will remove it. So if you do run into that problem, then just make sure that you go to layer and then clear it. Okay, now let's just very quickly get on to saving this, and then we'll get up and running with our modeling. So we'll go to File and Save As, and here it's got Undo History selected, so that's going to save this history. So if you want to keep that history, then when you go to File and Save As, make sure Undo History is selected, but the file will be much bigger. So if you want to save this out and say send it to someone, let's say you're sending this to a client who doesn't need the history, then you might just want to go and untick undo history and just do save as. The file is going to be much smaller. So even if you were going to put this on an email, for example, you're not really going to save this with the undo history selected because it's going to be really big. So you can untick it if you want it much smaller. Okay, so we can do save as. If you want to save the document, so it will also save a lot of the settings that you've got within the scene, then you can go to document and save as documents. Or you can also do a save as, where are we? I'm losing my place here. Yes, save document, and we can also import and export the documents. And we can also export out some of the alphas that we've got within the scene. And that is pretty much it, okay? So make sure that you go to File and Save As. And don't just save just the document, otherwise it will not save the model, okay? So if you do it that way, then it's only going to save out like an image of this model and you won't be able to edit into it. So make sure you are saving as the File and Save As. Okay, that's all for now, and I will see you in the next video where we start modeling this skull. I hope you enjoyed that, and take care for now. Goodbye.